Good evening. Thanks so much for coming along to this event. In his 2009 memoir, Sir Harry Evans, the greatest British newspaper editor of his generation, wrote, "We were plunged into many mysteries in my 14 years as editor of the Sunday Times, but the most profound was right there in our own office. That mystery is the subject of tonight's talk. Evans was born not far from here, in Eccles. The family home was Renshaw Street, whose houses, he later recalled in a book, were so narrow that people shook their heads about how hard it was to get a coffin down the staircase. His father was a train driver who steered munitions trains through the blackness of wartime Britain. His mother was one of 13 siblings from Stockport, only 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Evans later grew up in Newton Heath. When he started his career in the 1950s, Manchester was a newspaper city, chock full of thriving local and national titles. He estimated that no fewer than 26 newspapers were produced within a couple of miles of the 4 central railway stations. His career began not on the Sunday Times or the Manchester Evening News or even the Northern Echo, all of which he later worked for, but on the Ashton-under-Lyne Reporter, an old-fashioned newspaper where he learned the art of parring, walking the streets and chatting to strangers to pick up any information that could be crammed into the paper. He only succeeded in work like that. You only succeeded in work like that if you had a degree of tenacity. Evans had tenacity in spades. When I wrote a long piece about Evans for The Mill last year, I interviewed his wife, Tina Brown, who herself edited The New Yorker and Vanity Fair. "I've never met anyone more tenacious than Harry," she told me. "He would literally never give up." So Harry's tenacity delivered some of Fleet Street's most consequential investigations. But there was one story he never managed to run down, one mystery that he never managed to untangle. In November 1977, Evans dispatched the top Sunday Times foreign correspondent, David Holden, to the Middle East to cover a region that seemed to be at a tipping point. The historic visit of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to Jerusalem a few weeks earlier, the first time an Arab head of state had visited since the birth of Israel, was creating ripples from Beirut to Damascus. The last stop on Holden's trip was Cairo, where his body was found the next morning dumped next to a road near the airport. Who killed Holden? That's what our guests tonight, Peter Gillman and Emanuele Midolo, have spent years trying to find out. In Peter's case, not just years, but decades. Peter is an author and journalist who first wrote for the Sunday Times in 1965. He spent 15 years on its staff, 5 as a member of its Insight investigative team, and he later frequently reported from the Middle East. Peter was one of the journalists tasked by Evans with working out who had murdered Holden. And on the last of the 2 times that he met his old editor, Evans expressed regret for not cracking the mystery. "We must solve the case," Evans told him. For Evans and for Peter, the Holden case was the one that got away. Emanuele is an investigative journalist with 15 years of experience who has worked at the Times and the Sunday Times since 2020. It was his decision to get in touch with Peter that prompted this collaboration. Peter and Emanuele's book, Murder in Cairo, Solving a Cold War Mystery, which is right there, takes us inside what spies call the wilderness of mirrors. They have kindly made the trip to Manchester, to the library where Sir Harry's archive will be before long, to tell us the story in person tonight. Peter and Emanuele, thank you.
Thank you. So that's our man, David Holden. I think it's a very strange photograph. It looks, I think it's quite ambiguous, like the man himself. He's looking you straight in the eye, but on the other hand, he's got his hand covering his mouth, which is a symbol of dissimulation and concealment. And what is he trying to present with that? Is he the road-weary journalist who covered the waterfront across the world, or is it some kind of symbol with a cigarette? Existential angst? Not quite sure. He was a very difficult person to get to know, and we regarded him as a player, We were trying to work out what games he was playing. And as we conducted our research, it's in two phases. My first phase lasted a year at the time. The second phase was another 5 years, much more recently. We found there were very few people who could say they knew Holden very well at all. Now, that's me in 1977. I think compared with Holden, I look rather artless. The photograph was taken in Jordan, and I'll explain what I was doing in Jordan shortly. As you said, I first wrote for the Sunday Times in 1965. I joined the staff in the early 70s and was thus privileged to be there through the entire regime of Harry Evans, the greatest newspaper editor ever, no question. That is a very typical pose of Harry. He's looking very determined. He's not quite looking at camera, but he's giving the kind of look he would give you when he was questioning about your story. And he would weigh up what your story was, what it amounted to, was it sound, and could he trust you? And once he trusted you, he went with it absolutely. And there was no greater reassurance to know that Harry was the man who was backing you, no matter where your story took you, and he would print it no matter what. And I say all that in respect of the reason I was in Jordan, which I'll come to shortly. He had his faults. I think the biggest fault was he wanted to please too many people at once. And sometimes he would make promises to do with different people that they could both be the Washington correspondent. And his secretary, the long-suffering Joan Thomas, used to follow him around the building. And when he said, "I'd like you to be the Washington correspondent," she would say to him, that person quietly, "Don't pack your bags just yet. We need to sort this out." So I would say that was his greatest failing, but he was, as I said, a great editor, and it was to work through that time, I think, was being part of one of the great adventures of journalism. That's the newsroom at the Sunday Times. Some of those people worked on the Holden inquiry. The one in the middle with his hand there is a man called Paul Eddy. He was the editor of Insight, and I was his deputy editor. We essentially ran it together. This man here is called Cal McChrystal. He was part of the team that went to Cairo after Holden was killed, and there's another man somewhere. This man there, John Barry, I'll come back to him. He was one of the team who went to Cairo after the death. I'll talk to you more about those, but I'm going to talk about another story first. That's the reason I went to the Middle East a number of times in 1977. I went to Israel in early that year to do another story and heard from the local Jerusalem correspondent stories of how Palestinians were being tortured by the Israeli security and intelligence authorities. And I talked to some of them myself. It was pretty horrific. Took the story back to Harry, and he agreed that Paul and I should go back to Israel and the occupied territories and follow the story through. And he said, "I want you to tell me this story is not true because I don't want to have to publish it." We came back after 3 weeks operating undercover in Israel and the occupied territories. We interviewed 44 Palestinians who'd been interrogated by the Israelis and produced this story, which said unequivocally, Israel systematically tortures Palestinians. And at that time, it broke a collusive silence about Israel, which pervaded the British media up to that period. And the reason why it was such a difficult and tough story to publish was it broke the silence and inquired seriously and systematically in how Israel was behaving in the occupation. I have to say that the things we found then have nothing on what's happening now, but I won't go there just yet. But they were doing it then, they're doing it now, but now it's far worse. But it was an incredibly strong and brave thing for Harry to publish, and it caused a phenomenal row. All of that was in the summer of 1977. Later that year, there was a historic rapprochement between Egypt and Israel, historic enemies, which saw the first movement towards recognition of Israel by any Arab country, and that is a meeting between President Sadat on the left and Prime Minister Menachem Begin when Sadat visited Jerusalem and went to the Israeli Knesset in 1977. And that was a monumental shift in the politics of the Middle East at that time. It was therefore appropriate for the Sunday Times to send its chief correspondent to the Middle East to try and judge sentiment, what was going to happen in the other Arab countries in response to Sadat's move. And the man that was sent was David Holden. He was sent on a 10-day swing through the Middle East, starting in Damascus on November the 27th, going to Amman, and to he didn't go to Beirut. He went to Amman, and then finally caught into Israel and the occupied territories, and then finally caught the plane to Cairo from Amman on the evening of December the 6th. And from that moment on, he disappeared. At the Sunday Times, we didn't hear from him for about 3 days. There was a lot of consternation. At first, he thought we was just lying low, maybe protecting some sources. But as the week went on, he got more and more concerned. And finally, on the Saturday night, following his disappearance, his body was found and identified in the chief city mortuary in Cairo. And it was found to have been killed, shot through the back by a single bullet which penetrated his heart. And it looked like a very, very serious professional shot. This was some hit person who knew exactly what they were doing. So somebody wanted Holden dead very badly. And what happened immediately after that was that Harry sent a team of 6 of us out to the Middle East to, as it were, cover Holden's tracks, find out exactly what he'd been doing, who he'd been talking to. And I remember that the only words that Harry gave me in terms of how you look after yourself was to say, watch out for Mossad, they're the best intelligence agents in the world, which is a reference back to the Israeli torture story we'd done and the first possible theory of why Holden might have been killed, revenge by Israel for what President Begin called the single most damaging article ever written about Israel since its founding in 1948. So in these days, Manu will tell you, you get security briefings, you get flak jackets, you get burner phones, you get all kinds of advice. You're prepped for about a week on going off the danger zones. We had nothing, and the same thing applied when I went to Northern Ireland, which I covered quite a lot through the Troubles. We spent a week following the publication of the Sunday Times and that Sunday, which had a little story that said David Holden killed. We then spent a week going over his traces, trying to find out what he'd been doing and how he'd been killed. I'll deal with how he'd been killed first. What we worked out gradually was he'd been picked up at the Cairo airport by one of these cars, a battered Fiat, which actually looks like a pirate taxi. He'd been driven around in that for some time, transferred to another car. Sorry, I'll come back to her. Transferred another car, and in that car was the one he'd been shot. And his belongings were dumped in a third car, and the belongings were found as that rather poignant picture of the typewriter and some of his belongings. So 3 cars were involved in the hit. One picks him up, he's transferred to another one, shot in that, and some of his belongings are found in the third. So what that adds up to is possibly a team of 6, 8 people who were given the task of killing Holden. So it's now looking even more serious, even more as though there's somebody wanted very seriously dead indeed. We found out that over the period of maybe 10 days, but during the first week, various interesting things happened. The minute I arrived in Amman, this rather glamorous lady came up to me and said, hello, my name's Kaniza Murad. Have you come to find out about David Holden? He was a wonderful man. I was rather taken aback by this, and it turned out she was a French journalist who'd met Holden on that last 10 days swing through the Middle East. She kind of attached herself to him, and she spent quite a long time following him from one place to another, so it seemed to us. We couldn't work out. We were already beginning to discuss theories. Who was she following for? Was she following him in order to tip off the Egyptians when Holden was arriving? Didn't know. There was another question we didn't know. She told me she had dinner with him over 2 evenings, one in Damascus and one in Amman. And on the second one, she told me that she'd remained in his room till 2 o'clock in the morning, having a drink with him. And I did not have the courage then to ask her if they'd done anything else. Although 45 years later, Manu did ask that question and got the answer, which he'll save up for you. So she was one interesting character we met. What was she really about? Was she following him about? Was she trying to find out information on his movements? Didn't know. Another enigma we had. Remember, there was a writer, James Morris, who was reported the Everest expedition in 1953 for the Times. Later transitioned and became Jan Morris, celebrated, thank you very much, celebrated travel writer, a good friend of Holden, well, quite a good friend. Nobody was a really good friend of Holden. On December the 5th, the day before he died, Holden sent Jan Morris this postcard showing the citadel of Jerusalem with the enigmatic message on the back. In Jerusalem, in the Middle East, citadels still have their uses. And Jan Morris, as she then was, said, I have no idea what that was about. That was another enigma for us. What was also interesting was, although we filled in a lot of days of his last 10-day trip, we had no idea what he did on the afternoon of December the 5th, apart from sending Jan Morris a postcard referring to the fact that he'd been in the old city. At the end of that week, we published the story. We all sent back our material. Paul Edin and I from Amman, John Barry and Calum Pistol from Cairo, Helena Cobham from Beirut, Tony Terry from Jerusalem. We sent back all the material we had from what he'd been doing that week, who he'd met, what interviews he'd done, and so on. And essentially, the headline, Who Killed David Holden? It said in journalism, when you ask a question in journalism, you either don't know the answer or you don't care about the answer. In this case, who killed David Holden? Answer, we don't know. So we spent 3,000 words saying, we don't know who killed him. And the rest of it was a kind of coverage of his life and that last week and so on, and a discussion of some theories, but essentially conundrum. So what happened at the end of that was that we then packed up for Christmas. We got home just on Christmas Eve, and in the New Year, Harry said, you haven't found out who killed him, go back. And I went back to the Middle East with John Barry. We then went to 4 capitals. We went to Cairo, Amman, Beirut and Damascus, again covering his tracks. And in Beirut, we had one of the more interesting encounters of my journalistic career. This is the headquarters of the PLO in Beirut. And we decided that we should go and ask the PLO, did you kill David Holden? And we didn't knock on the door and say, let us in. We actually set up the meeting. But we were taken into a room in this, that was the building after being bombed by Israelis. We'd taken into an office room. A man called Abu Nidal was, Abu, haven't got it. Abu Jia, that's right, he was the deputy to Arafat. And sitting in the corner was a man I knew about, a man called Ali Hassan Salameh, who was notorious as the person who was theoretically organized the kidnap of Israeli athletes in Munich in 1972, and therefore was a prime target of the Israelis. So we asked the question, well, in fact, they made it easy for us. I said, I expect you've come to ask us whether we killed David Holden, haven't you? So we were very gratefully said, yes, we'd like to know, please. And they said, well, we didn't kill him, and I'll give you 2 reasons why. Number one, we don't believe in killing journalists. And number 2, we regard the Sunday Times as our friend because of the story you wrote about the Israeli torture of Palestinians. So not quite sure whether they wanted their approbation, but anyway, we decided we'd take the denial at face value, and it seemed to me entirely valid. While we were there in Beirut having this encounter, some rather dramatic things were happening back in London. There were some thefts. Does anybody know what a telex is? Some older you people might know what a telex is. It's messages that are sent by journalists. I haven't talked about old tech and new tech, right? No mobile phones, no word pressers, no computers, none of that. In order to get your copy back to London, you either had to phone it through, and someone at the other end would type it out, or you had to type it out on a very clanky machine that would be printed in one city and then reprinted at the other end. And what we found was that someone had broken into the Sunday Times foreign department and had stolen the telexes, which I was sending back to John Barry, giving our news of what we found out and of our movements. And we looked back further, and we also found that earlier, someone had stolen some of David Holden's telexes as well, giving the details of his movements. The Sunday Times tightened up its security that night. It locked the Foreign Office door and Foreign Department door, and then there was another theft the next night from the wire room where the telexes came in. So this told us someone is very serious indeed about what we're getting into, what we're finding out. And we knew at that moment The people who wanted Holden very seriously dead appeared to want to know very badly what we were finding out. At that point, Harry Evans said, right, this has got really even more serious. You still don't know who killed him. I want you to inquire into the whole of David Holden's life, which is what we then did. And that's what I spent the next 6 months doing. He was born in Sunderland. His father was the editor of the Sunderland Echo. He was evacuated in the war. He had very sickly, had polio as a child. And then during the war, he got a place at Emanuele College, Cambridge, and that's him sitting in the top. He read geography there. And there's a rather, thank you. That's a picture in 1945 at a wedding. We think that when he was at Cambridge, he was approached by MI6. It was a familiar recruiting ground. And we think they set him up to be a British agent, but nothing came of it. He was a teacher through the late 40s. He didn't like teaching very much. And then he went to study at Northwestern University in Evanston in Chicago. He looked as though he wanted to travel. He wanted the excitement to travel. But that was all a key to what was happening in Northwestern University was this man. This is a man called Leo Silverman, who was an academic in South Africa. He turned out to have a lot of very fine academic qualifications, but he was also a charlatan, an imposter. He claimed to have been a professor at Balliol College when he wasn't. And the crucial thing that we found out was he was Holden's lover. Holden, for 10 years, had a relationship with Leo Silverman, and we know that because the man on the right, who was his younger brother, Freddie Silverman, told us that. And it was he thought it was a very important relationship both for Leo Silverman and for Holden. And that was also one of the first clear indications we had of Holden's sexuality, and the first firm idea we had, the first confirmation we had that he was actually gay. We didn't know that, and that was another part of the concealment part of his life, the player part of his life, remembering what we do about attitudes, both social and legal attitudes towards being gay or queer in Britain before the Homosexuality Reform Act in the 1960s. That relationship went on for 10 years. Holden joined the Times in 1954. That's a photograph taken when he joined the Times. He worked at the Times and then the Guardian and then the Sunday Times. Leo Silverman died in 1960, and 1962 Holden married Ruth Holden, or Ruth Lynham, a journalist and PR agent as she was. Was it a lavender marriage? Probably was. What was the marriage about? It was probably a lavender marriage. But they appeared to be quite a fixed point in North London social life. They had a wonderful, he made friends with the Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon. That's the kind of dinner guests they would have. They were living at quite an elevated level. And he moved from the Guardian to the Times and then the Sunday Times, were embarked on a career first as a special correspondent. I need to mention that when he was working at the Times, he was in Cairo in 1956 at the time of the Suez invasion and was interned with another other journalists at that time. He also wrote books, and he did a lot of broadcasting. He wrote books about Saudi Arabia, which is something Emanuele will tell you about. And he also worked a lot for the New York Times. And one of the things that was curious about him, we found, looking at his writing had a kind of rather wry, skeptical, but generally positive note to it. He didn't seem to think ill of very many people. He liked to see the best in people, except occasionally, most spectacularly in the case of Chile. This is the invasion of the presidential palace in Santiago, the day that President Allende was suppressed by a coup led by General Pinochet. And Holden had been in Santiago a few days before and wrote an astonishingly vitriolic piece about Allende. It was as if he was breaking cover. Was he expressing his true sentiments by attacking Allende in astonishingly forthright terms? He did the same thing to Fidel Castro of Cuba. Just sometimes he lost the reactivity and had a full-on vitriolic attack on these people, which, to get down to it, could have been scripted by the CIA. So one of the other things we wondered was, had he been recruited by the CIA, or was he pretending to be very right-wing in order to conceal his other allegiance? What I now need to do is take you back to Leo Silverman, because Leo Silverman we knew he was quite left-wing, as well as being something of an imposter. He appeared to have Soviet sympathies, and one of our theories was that in the period of that relationship, Silverman had recruited Holden in some way to work for the Soviet Union. So the theories we were playing with was that he'd been approached by the MI6, but nothing came of it, recruited to work for KGB, but we had no proof of it whatsoever, and dallied in some way with the CIA, and whether it was for real or for play, we didn't know. All of which takes us to the last journey, which I mentioned. He, as we know, he spent that he did 10 days swing through the Middle East, culminating his death in Cairo in December 1977. And at the end of nearly 9 months of inquiring into Holden's life, his journey, his whole of his life, I wrote a memo for Harry Evans. Harry Evans kept saying, when are you going to produce something? When are you going to crack this? And we said, we haven't cracked it. And he finally says, I know you haven't cracked it, but I want what you've got. So I wrote a 30,000-word report. It took me 2 weeks in answering the question of who killed David Holden and why. We came to the tentative conclusion he'd been killed by the Egyptians because they're the best place to do it. And as for why, we thought he was involved in intelligence games, but we couldn't specify what. Now, the great tragedy was, would Harry have published something? We said we still don't know. We don't know whether he published it because the Sunday Times had just been closed in the great titanic battle between print unions and the management, and it was a lockout. Somebody referred to it earlier as a strike. It was a management lockout, so there was no newspaper for Harry to publish any of our results in. Anticlimax, except that I stayed with the story. And I just want, the last person I'm going to tell you about is a woman called Alexandra Johnson, who was an American diplomat. I got to know her arising from the torture story we wrote. She, at the time when the Sunday Times was closed, she approached the Sunday Times and said, I know your torture story is true. I have a load of documents which prove it, because I interviewed Palestinians myself to give them visas. And she handed over a load of secret documents which substantiated our story. There was no Sunday Times to publish it in. So I took her to Washington and handed the whole story over to the Washington Post. And yes, I met Ben Bradley, Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein, and was in seventh heaven. I stay with her even after the formal end of the Holden inquiry. I stayed in touch with her, and each time I got myself a commission in the United States, I went to see her. And the last time I saw her in the United States was in 1986, when she told me everything she knew about the CIA operation in the Middle East. She told me that the base in the Middle East citadels still have their uses. Picture of Old Town with a fortress. The CIA had a secret station in Jerusalem, which they weren't supposed to have, but that's where they operated from. And she also told me the name of the man who was the CIA chief in the Middle East, and that was a man called Jim Feast. And so I tucked all that information away. From time to time, I returned to it, but I didn't take it up fully until 5 years ago. I got a telephone call from Manu, who I now hand over to.
Well, I wonder how I'm going to top that. You said all the sexy stuff, so that leaves me. In 2020, Harry Evans died. He was 92, and unfortunately, I never met Harry. And you know, he's always been a hero of mine. And I joined the Times and Sunday Times just a few months earlier. Now, this man, Peter Gillman, trained me in investigative journalism a long time ago. And Peter loved to tell these fantastic stories about, you know, the golden age of investigative journalism and the Harry Evans, and making us all very jealous and envious of those times when, you know, you could spend a year investigating a single story, no expense spared. So I decided to get in touch with Peter when I heard the news that that Harry had died. Now, someone today was saying that journalists were key workers, so we could actually go to the office. Not many decided to go to the office. I mean, this was the office in September 2020 when Harry Evans died. I was pretty much the only one in the office as I was reading the obit, and I decided to get in touch with Peter. And Peter again started reminiscing about this great adventure in journalism. And he added something at the end. He said, what you were saying, that the last 2 times he's seen Harry said that he was still obsessed with the Holden case. You know, the fact that they never managed to crack it. What did he say? That he was the biggest to regret?
Biggest regret of his career was he never solved the Holden case, and he said it twice the last.
And so that got me very intrigued, and I started doing a bit of digging. A bit of Googling, that is, because that's what investigative journalists do most of the time today. But I managed to find something, and I shared it with Peter, and that's when Peter decided to invite me to his house in South London. And only then he gave me this 110-page report, you know, that he typewritten back in 1978, which was supposed to be for the editor's eyes only. It was supposed to be a confidential memo. Went home and I just read it in one sitting, and I was completely blown away because it read. I mean, you heard some of the details about the investigation, only a fraction of what he and his colleagues had uncovered in 1977 and 1978. But he read like a John le Carre's novel, except of course it was all true. You know, the theft of the telexes and Holden being picked up at the airport in this stolen car and then shot to the heart. It was not something that you come across every day. And you know, the reason I came to this country was to become an investigative journalist, and I immediately grasped that this was, you know, a story like no other. And so I decided to do more digging based on the information that Peter had uncovered back in 1977. And I still remember I called Peter and I said, I think I found the name of the CIA station chief in Cairo in 1977. It was a guy named Jim Fees. And he said, oh, you just hit jackpot. And except, and this is a frustration that we encountered many times over the last 5 years. Fees had just died recently. He was actually in England, which makes it even more frustrating. And to add to the frustration, Peter realized that, you know, he's been looking for this man for 40 years and he had the wrong spelling of the guy's name. So, but in any case, even if he had the right spelling, he couldn't have found anything about the guy because he managed to keep his whole life and his whole career a secret. The only reason I could find it was because it was just a stroke of luck. The guy had died recently, and his daughter had decided to sell some of the guy's medals at auction, and so there was a Sunday Mirror story about him or something like that. Anyway, that led us into, well, first of all, we decided we couldn't make this mistake again. We needed to talk to all the people who were still alive, who had met Holden, knew what he was like, or, you know, could have known about this case. And that led us to this gentleman who was the controller for the Middle East for MI6 in the 1970s. We've been looking for this man for a long time. We weren't sure whether he was still alive. His name was Jeffrey Tantum. And eventually we managed to track him down in Bath. Peter called him up with some excuse, and the man was saying, you know, surprisingly, because we didn't expect him to be cooperative with us. He said, "I'm I'd be very happy to help you, but I have to warn you, I have dementia." So I can't remember any of those things that you want to know about. And that's another theme, unfortunately, when it comes to investigating a 48-year-old, 50-year-old murder mystery, that either people are dead or they can't remember. I mean, fair enough. It was 50 years ago. So again, in our quest to find people who met Holden, we managed to talk to Don McCullin, possibly the greatest photographer alive, who gave this fantastic, he was telling Tina Brown on stage at the Harry Evans Summit a couple of years ago. Tina asked him, you know, in your career as a photojournalist, you've been to the most dangerous places on earth. What was the most dangerous moment for you, you know, in your life, in your career? And he said, it was in Uganda. I could have died, and I have to thank David Holden for that. Peter and I were in the audience. We looked at each other, and so we decided to grab poor Don McCullin, was 87 now, and get him to actually tell us the full story. Now, the full story was that again, Holden had been at the right time, in the right place, but somehow had been tipped off that a coup was going on in Uganda, and he fled, he escaped, and he left his colleagues, including Don, in the hotel room, who were then all arrested and taken to this military prison, which John also said was a terrible hygiene, and that sort of confirmed some of the suspicions that Holden must have. It wasn't just this great foreign correspondent who happened to be, you know, in Egypt in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. He wasn't in Congo in 1960 when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated, 62 in Yemen, and so on until 1973 in Chile. He was there before the events would take place, and he would leave at the right moment. He would do the same in Chile in 1973, just before the coup. He fled. So he was being tipped off by someone. Now, to try to find out who that someone was led us into all sorts of directions. Now, this man, you might know him, is Ian Fleming. He was better known as the father of James Bond, creator of James Bond. But after the war, he actually became the foreign editor for the Sunday Times. And he was, well, during the war, Ian Fleming famously worked in British intelligence, naval intelligence. And when he became a journalist, a foreign manager, he decided to hire lots of friends being the operative word, to act both as foreign correspondents and spies for MI6. I'm not sure we're going to talk about this man. Yes. One of the people that he hired was this guy, who was Holden's predecessor as Sunday Times foreign correspondent in Cairo. His name was John Slade Baker. And we found the guy's diaries at Oxford, St. Anthony's College. The guy had written thousands of pages about his activities. And he, you know, in the diary, he was speaking quite candidly about his dual job as a foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times and a spy for MI6. He was actually being trained in both professions. And he also met Holden. It was in Beirut with Holden and Kim Philby. So the scope of the investigation, which obviously was about the murder of David Holden, took us into the direction of these sorts of connections between the world of journalism and spying. And we managed to find so much stuff about these people that that Peter, for example, had no idea about. Did someone ask you whether you were?
Someone asked me, was he a spook? It had not occurred to me that journalists were spooks at that stage. You said that I pictured me in 1977. It looks pretty naive now, doesn't it?
Now, the man who hired Holden at the Sunday Times was not Harry Evans. Harry Evans is still was not at the paper yet. It was this guy, Frank Giles, who actually succeeded Evans as the editor of the Sunday Times, and then he was sacked because of the fiasco of the fake Hitler diaries. Giles had been hired by Ian Fleming himself He sort of strangely doesn't really mention that in his memoir. It's an incredibly boring book. I mean, if you want to read a great book about the Sunday Times, you should read Harry Evans' books. You shouldn't read this man's memoir because it's incredibly self-serving and boring. Anyway, he was the one who hired Holden in 1965, and we started to understand that there was a pattern there. There was a direct connection between the people that had been hired by Fleming to become foreign correspondents. Were doing, this sort of, shall we call them, moonlighting for the British intelligence services. Another man who had been hired by Fleming was this guy, again, familiar pose of Sunday Times foreign correspondents for some reason. This guy was Donald McCormick, who was again in the foreign department for many years, and only quite recently we found out that he was potentially the thief of the telexes that Peter was showing you, the ones that had been stolen from the Sunday Times offices when Peter was in the Middle East. And the reason for that, we think, is because the MI6 was also trying to understand what happened to Holden, but they wanted to cover up some of the other activities that they, some of the other things that they were doing with journalists in foreign countries. So that was one of the sorts of mysteries that we managed to solve. No, this is me looking quite naive. In Egypt, I thought, again, in a rather naive way, that I could go to Egypt and I could find the answers to the questions that that we wanted to answer about who killed David Holden and why. And unfortunately, the Egyptian authorities were not cooperative at all. I expected after 45 years that maybe someone would tell me something, and instead I got this sort of veil of omerta from the Egyptian authorities. The thing that I got was that I was followed all the time by this gentleman. This is a shot that I actually sent to Peter, and I don't have, because as Peter was saying, we got all sorts of fancy things at the paper now. They give us a burner phone. They tell us to be careful. They don't tell us watch out for Mossad and pat us on the back and expect us to watch out for the best intelligence agency in the world. I couldn't get any information out of the Egyptian authorities, which sort of strengthened our suspicion about the Egyptians in a way. The thing that I could find instead was, and again, I mean, I'm really happy to be here in this library, because libraries have been a great resource for us in this investigation. I mean, libraries and archives. Anne, where's Anne? She's still there. Opened us the archives of News UK, of the Times and Sunday Times, and was incredibly helpful. And the other archive that, funny enough, gave us something was the CIA archives. Now we found that the CIA had a file on Leo Silberman, which is a bit of a strange thing to do. Don't know why the CIA would bother having a file about a British anthropologist. But they had the same suspicions about Silberman that Peter had. The files were heavily redacted, but you could kind of read between the lines. There is a reason to believe that he's an imposter. In another cable, it's actually heavily hinted that he might be a spy. And there was a reference to France that led me to another library, the National Library in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, where I found this correspondence between Leo Silberman and this man, a French composer called Louis Seguer. Now, Peter was saying they had some suspicion about Silberman being left-wing, but what they didn't know was that Silberman wasn't just left-wing. He was a communist fanatic, and he was a recruiter for the Comintern and the KGB since the 1930s. So this is what these 70 letters showed us. And the other thing that he was doing was he was recruiting, he was using a sort of a mix of sex and politics to recruit these young men to the communist cause. And in one of the letters, he actually refers to Holden as his young pet. So that sort of gave us a whole different perspective on the relationship between the two men, and also about Holden's life, because as Peter was saying, you know, the theories that they had back in 1977 was that maybe Holden had been working for at least one intelligence agency. They didn't have any sort of, well, they had the evidence of the fact that he'd been writing for this magazine that had been bankrolled by the CIA. And he'd been writing this sort of vitriolic attacks on these socialist leaders around the world. But the fact that he'd been killed in such a manner was a sort of sign that he must have betrayed some sort of cause. So the sort of leap of faith then was to speculate that Holden must have betrayed his paymasters, whoever they were. This gave us an indication that since 1949, 1950, when Holden had started to have this personal relationship with Leo Silberman, he had been recruited by the Soviets via this guy, via his lover, and this was even before he had become a journalist. So the idea, the sort of perspective shifted, and we read the articles in a whole different light, as in Holden was actually dissimulating his true allegiances, a bit like Kim Philby had been doing for so long. But the actual confirmation came, I'm not going to go into that, I don't have time. The actual confirmation came from human intelligence, as we call it, as in there were a couple of confessions that were made, not to us, unfortunately, because again, all these people are dead. But the man on the right is a guy called Michael Adams, who was a journalist and a friend of Holden, and he also was obsessed with Holden's fate. Wanted to find out who killed him and why. And on a visit to Cairo, he asked this man, Mohammed Haikal, was the most important journalist and politician in Egypt for many, many years. And Haikal was about to walk into a lift, and he said, you know, just one question, who killed David? And Haikal said, we did. And then the doors of the lift closed, never saw him again. And there was quite a dramatic moment for Michael Adams. We also found that Haikal had been telling other people, we found at least two people he'd been talking to, and he sort of elaborated a little bit more in terms of why the Egyptians killed Holden. It was a matter of state, he said. On the other side, the reason why came from, this was literally a deathbed confession, because the man on the right was an academic called Fred Halliday. He also met Holden, and in 2010, Halliday was dying of cancer, and he phoned up one of his best friends, a guy named Roger Hardy, who's here on my left, and said, Roger, I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone. In the 70s, David Holden came to me unannounced and said, I have a confession to make. I'm a Marxist. I've been working for the Soviet Union all my life. And that sort of closed the circle of, you know, the investigation. The nice thing for me is that, you know, despite the fact that obviously we reopened the investigation in 2020, thanks to, well, on the back of Harry's determination, this information actually came to Peter completely by chance. Roger decided to get in touch with Peter and told him this story, which confirmed all the suspicions that we had about David Holden. The only regret really is that Harry is no longer with us, because I would have loved to see what you know, he would have thought about our findings. This is us meeting Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, which was a great moment for me, and you can see that Harry is towering over us. And the thing that sort of stayed with me from this is this great quote, including in one of his books, which says that things are not what they seem on the surface. So dig deeper, dig deeper, dig deeper.